What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this is going to be a guide to Joey-Pegasus format, which is the official format that follows Android format. Now, if you've been following my coverage of Android format, then you should be pretty familiar with what a lot of the top decks of this format do look like. This format didn't really add too many new cards, so a lot of the decks do look extremely similar. However, the cards that it did add were so impactful that it really is worth covering this as its own unique format, as the cards are pretty meta warping. Before we get to exactly what the new cards are though, I think it's important to discuss the limited list, which actually does include some of the new cards added to the format on it. So let's dive into that first. So Joey-Pegasus uses the May 2003 limited list, and that's sort of where we place this on the timeline in May 2003, right after this limited list was sort of introduced. And the limited list is largely the same from Android format. It mainly just adds some new cards to the list. Things like Sinister Serpent are newly introduced from the video game promos in that one copy. Harpy's Feather Duster is also a video game promo that goes to one copy here. And Graceful Charity is from Starter Deck Pegasus, which is at 2 copies for some reason. I mean, Graceful Charity is insanely strong, so I'm really not sure why they didn't just limit this. But I guess they were like, it's not like Pot of Greed. It's not a +1. It kind of goes net neutral and card advantage. So, let's just put this at 2, see what happens. Unfortunately, this card is insanely strong, and some people actually do think it's as good, if not better, than Pot of Greed. So this does make the format a little bit sacky, but I do think that it's still fun to play despite this. And it's just a feature of the format. Certain formats are going to have certain cards unlimited or at more copies than you might expect. And that may lead to it not being your favorite format, but it can lead to it being fun for other people to play. So, if you don't like Graceful Charity too, you don't have to play Joey-Pegasus, but I do think that it's worth giving it a shot just to see how it feels. The only other change that was made to the list in terms of the older cards was actually limiting Heavy Storm down to 1 copy. This makes a lot of sense as Heavy Storm was heavy limited beforehand, and clearly they didn't want us to have access to too much mass board removal in terms of spell and traps. They thought that 2 was a good number, and with Harpy's Feather Duster being introduced as well, limiting Heavy keeps that number at 2. So, I think that this is fine. Honestly, people were just playing 1 heavy in Android format, because Mystical Space Typhoon being reactive is so valuable in terms of just stopping things like your opponent's Imperial Orders and other spells and traps that are continuous that you do really want to stop before they actually get to activate. So I don't really think that, this limit will actually change too much. I actually think that people will be playing Harpy's Feather Duster over Heavy Storm in a lot of these decks. But it's good to know for the side deck, as a Heavy Storm in the side is still very good, even if you're just playing the 1 Harpy's Feather Duster in the main. But now that we've discussed the change to the limited list, let's dive into what I think are the core cards of the format. So in terms of new cards, as I said, there aren't too many new cards released into this format. The new card set releases were Starter Deck Joey, Starter Deck Pegasus, and the Stairway to the Destined Duel promotional cards. And of those, Starter Deck Joey and Starter Deck Pegasus both released 2 new cards each into the format. And the Stairway to the Destined Duel promotional cards released 3 new cards. So all told, that's just 7 new cards introduced into the format. But I do think that 4 of them are actually incredibly good and could see play in pretty much any deck, potentially. Of course, deck space this format is tight, so they might not all be able to have a slot in every deck, but they are all really good to know about as options for when you're building your deck. The first of these is Sinister Serpent. Now, as I mentioned, this is limited on the list because it is just really strong having this in multiple copies, because basically Sinister Serpent worked with its pre-errata effect. So the effect that you're seeing on screen with Sinister Serpent here is not actually the effect that we use in Joey-Pegasus format. We use the same effect that this had in GOAT format, if you're familiar with that one. So basically all it reads is, during your standby phase, if this card is in your graveyard, you can add it back to hand. There's no sort of other extra condition about banishing another Sinister Serpent from your graveyard. It's just basically a free card back into your hand if it's in your graveyard during your standby phase. This may seem kind of underwhelming at first, especially given that there aren't as many cards this format that do require you to discard cards as there are in other formats. But there are 2 Graceful Charity in the format, and so if you play Graceful Charity and discard Sinister Serpent as one of your discards here, that makes the Graceful Charity a lot better because you're getting that Serpent back for later. In addition, Serpent can be used as just a recurable chump blocker. Obviously not the best use of this card, but it can come up, and just having access to a monster at all times can be very nice. But really, I think that this is the only monster that could see play in pretty much every deck. There are 2 other monsters that I'll talk about later that got introduced, but I think they're much more niche. Moving on to the spells, we have the most important introduction of the format, which is Graceful Charity. Now, Graceful Charity, you draw 3 cards, discard 2. So in terms of actual like card advantage math here, you're playing 1 card and gaining 3 cards and sending 2. So realistically, you're using up 3 cards to draw 3 cards. So, you know, it might seem, oh, this is kind of like a net neutral thing. So it's not really as good as something like Pot of Greed, which is you're using 1 card and gaining 2 cards, so it's a +1. However, there are ways to use Graceful Charity in ways that you are basically just going like +2 on this, gaining 3 cards and discarding 2 cards that you're not really going to be using. Sinister Serpent is one way to gain a certain amount of advantage off the Graceful Charity as you do get it back, but there are also things like Thunder Dragon, which you can add to your deck, which is basically a monster that you can discard for 2 more of it, which helps you deck thin. And then if you've got the 2 in hand, discarding them off of Graceful Charity is not bad, because basically there's not really many uses for Thunder Dragon in this format in the hand. There are plays you can do with like Snatch, Chill, and Change of Heart, where you can take an opponent's monster, tribute over it for a Thunder Dragon, which isn't bad, of course. And also there are fusion decks that do aim to summon Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon. So, you know, if you're playing either of those decks, then I mean, this card could get value in the hand, but for most decks, if they're playing Thunder Dragon, it's mainly just to pair with the Graceful Charity. So, you know, you draw 3, discard 2 Thunder Dragons, and that's pretty great. Even if you are just using this to go net neutral, I do think that this is incredibly, incredibly strong, because you are seeing 3 cards deeper into your deck. So, you know, if you are looking for a way to out an opponent's particularly bad board, you can potentially see more options and pick the options that are best for you in the given circumstance. I do really think that Graceful Charity is a card that requires a lot of skill to play, you know, optimally, as there are situations where you do want to hold the Charity just for a more opportune time to discard. And there are also cases where you draw 3 and the choice of what to discard can be very, very difficult. So I do think that this card does reward skillful players. But I do also think that this card can be extremely sacky, especially if someone draws into a second Graceful Charity off the first and just gets a lot of cards seen in their deck, and also gets a fair amount of cards in the graveyard for something like a Bazoo play later on. So the 2 Graceful Charity in this format are definitely probably going to be the most controversial part of it, and that will probably just turn some people away entirely from playing the format. But I do think that's a unique sort of dynamic that no other format in Yu-Gi-Oh's history has, as I'm pretty sure this is the only format where Graceful Charity was ever at 2. So, you know, if you do want to try that out, definitely check out this format. For the next spell, we've got Harpy's Feather Duster. Now, I mentioned in the limited list section of the video that I honestly don't think that this will change too much in the format, even though it is incredibly strong. In Android format, most decks were just playing like 1 Heavy Storm and 3 Mystical Space Typhoon, because Mystical Space Typhoon can respond to things like Imperial Order, Call the Haunted, etc. Things that you don't actually want your opponent activating in the first place, and that you can generally still get some value off of Feather Dustering or Heavy Storming, except in the case of Imperial Order, obviously. But that's a lot better just to nip in the bud, like with a Mystical Space Typhoon on your opponent's turn. So I do think that that still applies in this format, especially given that there's 1 more reactive spell or trap card in the form of Scapegoat that you don't necessarily want to hit with a Harpy's Feather Duster or Heavy Storm. So I do think that this card won't necessarily be the most meta-defining piece of spell and trap removal in the format, but it is incredibly good to know about. And I do think that it will change how people play around sort of mass spell and trap removal. Because, you know, in previous formats, Heavy Storm was the only form of clearing away your opponent's entire back row. So if your opponent had a lot of back row set, you could feel comfortable setting a lot of back row as well, because it meant that they were unlikely to use Heavy Storm on it. Now you don't have that option, so now it does become a lot more risky at any point to sort of set a bunch of spell and trap cards if your opponent hasn't already used the Harpy's Feather Duster. Now, the last card that I want to talk about in this section is a card that didn't actually make it onto the new limited list. Each of the 3 cards that I've already talked about here, all were powerful enough to make it on that list. The last card isn't quite yet, and that's Scapegoat. Now, Scapegoat is a quick play spell that lets you special summon 4 sheep tokens in defense position. They're all very, very weak at 0 attack and 0 defense. They can't be tributed for a tribute summon, and you can't summon other monsters the turn you activate this card, but you can actually normal set them. And this may seem kind of underwhelming, and in many ways it is a lot less impressive than the other cards on this list here. But I do think that it does have a lot of value in the deck as a defensive option. Jinzo is such an impressive card in this format, just like it is in Android, where if your opponent does get it out, there are very few ways to actually stop a major aggressive push once that's happened on their turn. So I do like having Scapegoat here as an option of a card that can potentially play around Jinzo a bit. And I do think that it does have some other applications as well. For instance, if you're playing Cannon Soldier in your deck, which I do still think is potentially a good card to play in good stuff decks, just like it was in Android format and before, just as a searchable way to deal that last bit of damage to your opponent. So I do still think it's worth playing, and when combined with Scapegoat, it can potentially equal 2,500 points of damage. And so I do think that this card is somewhat versatile. Now, of course, deck space is very tight, so it might not see play in every sort of deck. This is definitely a lot better for like stall decks or decks that just want to act more defensively, but I do think it potentially does have a place in these sort of good stuff beat spellcaster decks as well. Now, those are all the new cards that I wanted to talk about, but I should highlight some other cards in this format that you'll be very familiar with if you've been following my coverage of past formats, but are very important to know about for this format as well. Now, of course, any card on the limited list is probably good to know about, so I'm not really going to discuss them here. As you know, I have them all on screen in the limited list section of this video, so if you are interested in them, look over that. But besides the limited list, there are some very important cards to know about. Firstly, for the monsters, we've got a Kaiku, a Gemini Elf, and a Bazoo. And these are sort of the triangle of beaters in Android format because they all sort of like checkmate each other. Bazoo can get over Gemini Elf can get over Kaiku, and Kaiku can stop Bazoo from buffing itself up and thus get over Bazoo. So I do think that they still will see play as, staple cards in this format. I also think Kaiku has gained some extra value, being able to banish things like Sinister Serpent from the graveyard. So I do really think that, it's good to know about these cards and have them in your deck. In addition, Mystic Tomato, just insanely good card, can fetch out things like Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, and also just preserve board presence by fetching out more copies of itself. So I think that this card will still see staple play in this format as well. Cannon Soldier also can be fetched off of the Mystic Tomato, and as I mentioned with the Scapegoat, I do think that it's good to potentially have that in mind. You can potentially just play Cannon Soldier in a good stuff deck as a way to get rid of the last bit of damage, and also if you are playing Scapegoat, then it gets a lot better as well. And lastly, as I mentioned with Graceful Charity, I do think that Thunder Dragon is a good option to consider. I'm not necessarily sure how useful it will be, or if it's just better to not play it and just play cards that will get you more value. But I do think that it is something that people will be playing or experimenting with, so it's very good to know about. For the spells, most of the spells in this format are the power spells that, are on the limited list or that I just talked about, but there are some very important other cards to keep in mind, especially Mystical Space Typhoon. This is the sort of most popular non-power spell in the format, and it's easy to see why. As I mentioned with Harpy's Feather Duster, this is a reactive spell and trap removal card. So, if your opponent does activate something like Imperial Order to chain to spell and trap removal, you can Mystical Space Typhoon it, which is very, very good. So, I do like this over the sort of mass board clears of Harpy's Feather Duster and Heavy Storm, and it's very good to keep in mind when you're building a deck. The other cards here are a bit more situational, and honestly, I think that they'd be in the side deck here. Fissure and Tribute to the Doomed are both removal cards that you can play if you feel like you need more removal in games 2 and 3. I do think the Fissure's gotten a lot less good given the introduction of things like Scapegoat, and Tribute to the Doom has gotten better with the introduction of something like Sinister Serpent. So, while Tribute to the Doom had sort of fallen out of favor for a long time, I do think that with Sinister Serpent in the format, it could potentially see a new rise in popularity. Maybe not in the main deck, but I think in the side deck for sure. And the last spell that I want to talk about is Exchange. I do think that this is the best side deck card against Exodia, as once you get a piece of Exodia from your opponent's hand into your hand, they really have almost no way of getting that back, so you can pretty much easily win the duel at your leisure from that point. And I do think that with the introduction of 2 Graceful Charities, I do think that Exodia is a much better deck than it has been in the past, so it is something to keep in mind when you're building your side deck. For the traps, I do think the deck space is really tight, and a lot of the trap cards are sort of the first cards on the cutting block, but I do think that there are some really good inclusions that you can put into your main deck or side deck. Torrential Tribute is a really big one. In Android format, this wasn't quite as popular because you wanted to preserve your own board presence with things like, Kaiku, Gemini Elf, Bazoo. So you'd much rather trap whole your opponent's summoning out the monster that actually beats over your beat stick, rather than torrential tributing the whole field and clearing the field presence that you have. But I do think that with Scapegoat in the format, Torrential Tribute has gotten a lot better, as Scapegoat can just wall you out for a couple turns, which can be really annoying. And if your opponent has used the Scapegoat, using Torrential Tribute to just clear away all the goat tokens can be extremely, extremely good. So I do think this card's gotten a lot better in this format. And when Torrential Tribute gets better in the format, I do think that Trap Hole gets a little bit worse, as, you know, again, deck space is very tight, and you don't necessarily have the space to fit in a lot of sort of trap removal on your opponent's monsters, especially since Jinzo is such a big card in the format, and these don't really do anything to stop Jinzo. So I do think that, you know, Trap Hole maybe is a little less good in this format than in Android, but I still think it's a very good card to consider, as I do think that the Beatstick Triangle will still play a major role in this format. Next up, we've got two traps that are basically like graveyard fodder traps that also help you, you know, cycle a little bit. Jar of Greed and Time Seal. Now, Jar of Greed has seen a lot of play in Android format as just a way to draw deeper into your deck, and also just get graveyard fodder for things like Bazoo and Skull Lair. Time Seal has also seen play in this capacity, although I personally like it a lot less in that way. I think that Jar of Greed is just generally better, but you can play this as like a fourth Jar of Greed in a way. It kind of does the same thing, as your opponent will just lose a resource as opposed to you gaining one. So, you know, this is sort of in the same class as Jar of Greed in my opinion, and thus could potentially see play. And I actually think in the one tournament that was held in this format, which to be fair was held almost 3 years ago, so, you know, a lot of development could have happened since then. But Time Seal was in one of the topping decks, so, you know, it's good to know about. And lastly, for the traps, I think Magic Jammer could potentially see a resurgence in play this format, given the existence of Sinister Serpent. Magic Jammer, you know, you discard one card, negate a spell. Given all the powerful spells in this format, this can be very good, and Serpent makes the cost a lot more manageable. That being said, I'm not sure if Magic Jammer is actually good or just cope. That'll take some experimentation to tell, but I do think that these are sort of the other sorts of good cards to know about when building a deck in this format that aren't new and also aren't on the limited list. Now, I do have some example deck lists to show you if you just want to jump into the format with one of those. But before I do, there are some other new cards that this format introduced that I do think are a lot less relevant, but they're still good to talk about, so let's talk about them now. Penguin Soldier is probably the best of the other cards, and it does see some niche play potentially in stallier decks. It's a flip monster that when it's flipped up, you can target up to 2 monsters in the field, return those targets to hand. This can be very nice at sort of, you know, clearing away a lot of your opponent's field and setting them back a couple turns of summons. It can also be used to recycle your own flip monsters and even recycle itself. However, I don't necessarily think that this is the best card, even though it can fit into some more janky strategies. I just think there's a lot better options of removal here than Penguin Soldier can provide. Even if there are some sort of like fun combos you can do to it. So that's why I'm talking about it in this section. Next up, we've got Gryphon Wing, and this is a very interesting trap. It's not technically a counter trap, but it kind of is. It says when your opponent activates a Harpy's Feather Duster, negate its effects, and if you do, destroy all spells and traps your opponent controls. Now, this can be a major blowout if your opponent is playing a Harpy's Feather Duster while they have a bunch of back row on field, which is kind of nice. Unfortunately, the fact that it isn't a counter trap card actually kind of can play against it because, you know, if your opponent does have chainable back row, they can chain it to the activation of Gryphon Wing. So, you know, that's kind of an interesting flaw of this card. I don't think it's that big of a flaw, but it is something that can come up. Of course, I don't necessarily think that this card is that good because it's very specific, tailored to a one-of card in the format that you can just play around or just, you know, use stuff like Imperial Order to try and negate. So I don't necessarily think that this deserves to see play in pretty much any deck, but it is an option if you're really, really scared of Harpy's Feather Duster. You can play this, I guess. And I guess if enough people start playing this, people might go back to Heavy Storm. But, I mean, I don't really think that this card is that good. So I wouldn't recommend playing it. Lastly, we've got sort of a new jank card here that I'm sure that some people will try and make work, and that is Valkyrion the Magna Warrior. This is a 3,500 attack point monster that can't be normal summoned or set, but must first be special summoned by tributing an Alpha the Magnet Warrior, Beta the Magnet Warrior, Gamma the Magnet Warrior from your hand or field. You can tribute this card, then target one Alpha the Magnet Warrior, Beta the Magnet Warrior, and Gamma the Magnet Warrior in your graveyard, special summon them. Now, this is a much better version of Gate Guardian in my opinion, because Gate Guardian was a big beat stick that you had to sort of send these 3 tribute monsters from your field to the graveyard to bring out, which was incredibly difficult. The 3 pieces that you need to make Valkyrion are Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, all of which are, you know, pretty low attack and stat monsters. And Gamma and Alpha can both be searched off of Sangan. Unfortunately, Beta is unsearchable, but you know, if you're deck thinning enough with things like Sangan and potentially Giant Rat even to bring these out, then it's not the worst thing in the world to potentially draw. And also, you know, Valkyrion is also unsearchable, which is unfortunate. So you get 2 unsearchable cards in this combo here. But, you know, it is a lot better and more consistent than Gate Guardian. The fact that you can have them in hand as well as on field is pretty nice. And I guess, like, you know, you can get them back if you draw another Valkyrion, maybe. Like, I don't see why you'd potentially do that, but the tribute effect can come up, I guess, maybe. I wouldn't necessarily think that it's the best effect to use here, but it is something interesting at least. So I'm sure that people will try and make this work in a jank deck. Not sure if I'll be covering it on the channel or not. I sort of want to go a bit more quickly through a lot of these formats because I did spend a lot of time in Android format, and I did see that some people were getting tired of me just, you know, going through the same format over and over again. So this deck might not be worth covering this format. Let me know down in the comments below, though, what your thoughts on that are and whether you think I should cover it or not. And that's going to do it for all the new cards that Joey-Pegasus format introduces. Again, very small card pool changes here, but very impactful in terms of the core cards. Now that I've covered these, let's just show off some example deck lists that you can potentially use in this format to get you started. Now, I don't think that these are potentially the best versions of these sorts of decks. There's things that I kind of threw together as decks that I think could be pretty decent here. But of course, you know, more optimization will probably be needed on them. But they are potentially good places to start if you're interested. Now, this is a version of the deck that I think is probably going to be the best deck in the format, which is Tomato Control or Beast Spellcaster, or whatever you want to call it. It basically is very similar to how it was in Android format. The main changes are we swapped out Heavy Storm for Harpy's Feather Duster, included some Graceful Charities and a Sister Serpent. I also cut down on the number of beaters because I figured that, you know, we'd be drawing into them more consistently with Graceful Charities, and I felt that, like, adding an additional Magician of Faith here would be good at recycling the charities. I think there are some other potential changes you can make here, including a Nobleman in the main deck could be good, because I do think that more people will be on Magician of Faith to recycle their Graceful Charities and other powerful spells here. And also does hit things like Sinister Serpent that your opponent might set, or a Cyberjar as well. So I do think that Nobleman is maybe main deck worthy in this format and something to consider in the future. I also included a Scapegoat in the main deck here. This is maybe iffy. Again, deck space is very tight. Maybe this would be better served by another card here. But I do think that it can be good at stopping an opponent's major aggressive push with Jinzo potentially. And it can also pair very well with Cannon Soldier. If you drop your opponent down below 2,500, then this could potentially be the end of the game for them. I also made some changes to the side deck here from how it was in Android format, emphasizing more torrential tributes, putting in Tribute to the Dooms instead of Fissures, upping the exchanges to 3 because I do think that Exodia is potentially a very good deck in this format. But, you know, I'll discuss all this further in my deck breakdown for when I actually make a whole video devoted to this deck. So, you know, if you want a more in-depth reasoning behind, you know, the choices that I made here, then you can look for that. But I do think that this is a potential good place to start in the format. And I hope that it serves you well if you do decide to test it out. Now, this is a deck that is pretty much the sort of thing that everyone will be playing. But I do think that there is a sort of rogue deck that has gotten a lot better in this format that I think people will be testing out and that may prove to be extremely good. That deck is Exodia, and I figured that I'd show off a version of this deck list in this video because I do think that it is a very interesting take on the deck. The reason I'm showing this actually is because I tested this out in the Hypothetical Silly Snake format, which is basically this format but without the May 2003 limited list. And this deck was really good in that format. And the only change that I've made here to actually update this for Joey-Pegasus is taking out 1 copy of Graceful Charity because, you know, we had 3 Graceful Charity in that format. Here we only have 2. And other than that, it's pretty much exactly the same. The replacement that I made for that Graceful Charity was a Torrential Tribute, which can stem aggressive pressure on your opponent's part, although it does play a bit poorly with your Scapegoat, which we are playing 3 of here. But this deck can be really good at turboing out into your pieces. And so I do think that it is potentially worth looking at in this format. Maybe I'll test it in Joey-Pegasus and it'll turn out to be a lot worse than I expect it to be. But I figured I'd show this off here because Exodia is a fan favorite deck. And I do think that it's very interesting to see its evolution over the years. And hopefully it actually is pretty decent in this format, as there aren't really too many sort of non-Beast Spellcaster decks in the format that actually see regular play. Of course, from our testing of Android format, we found a couple decks that may potentially rival the Beast Spellcaster dominance in that format, so maybe that will also carry over to here. but only time will tell. And I will be exploring the decks that I really think can make a dent on the metagame in the upcoming days. But I hope that this was a helpful introduction to Joey-Pegasus format, and that if you are interested in playing it, you now have the tools to do so, and some potential example deck lists to take into some games. If you want to see more of my coverage of this format, then definitely subscribe to the channel. I'll be uploading videos on it very soon, and the best way to be notified when those come out is through subscribing. In addition, if you have any thoughts on this format for yourself that you want to share, please do so down in the comments below. I look forward to discussing with everyone as always. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.